Hello again, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Fast Tracking DER Projects, a toolkit for utilities, developers, and financiers, brought to you by RMI and GIAP. Thank you for joining us today to discuss this critical and timely topic. My name is Alberto Rodriguez from the Africa Energy Program at RMI, and I will be your host today. It's a pleasure to have you all. Today's webinar is the culmination of many years working in the DER space, very closely with DISCOs, distribution companies, developers, customers, and other stakeholders in ideating utility-enabled DER business models and working on de-risking projects at various stages. We sincerely hope that after today's session, we will see more stakeholders adopting this toolkit and its resources. Next slide, please. A few logistical notes before we get started. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on RMI's event page within 24 hours of this event, along with other related resources. 2, during the webinar, please feel free to drop any questions you may have into the Q&A function on your screen, and we will get to as many as we can. We will do our best to follow up for those questions that don't get responded. This webinar will be 60 minutes long. Today's webinar is structured into 2 parts. For the first part, we will provide an overview of RMI and GIAP's work in the space, and we will introduce the DER toolkit that is targeted for utilities, developers, and financiers. From there, we will zoom into some of the key resources the team has co-developed in close partnership with DISCOs and developers. We will conclude the first part of the webinar by showcasing 2 projects that have been operational for around 1 year, highlighting some of the impact metrics and learnings from these pioneering projects. The second part of the webinar will be a panel discussion. Next slide, please. On this slide, you can see the full team behind the DER toolkit. Starting from the top left of the slide, Suleiman Bababanu, who is RMI's Nigeria Country Director. I am next on the slide together with Wayne Omonuwa, both managers leading utility-enabled DER work in Nigeria. Today, we are also joined by Fausia Okediji, a manager at the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet. We will hear from Olatunde Okeowo, Fola Aminu, and Ridwan Suber, Senior Associates and Associates at RMI, on the various components of the DER toolkit. Lastly, my colleagues Collins Datsi and Saki Shah, both Senior Associates, will be running the show behind the scenes. Now, I would like to invite the first speaker, Suleiman Bababanu, to provide us with an overview of RMI's work in Africa.
Thank you very much, Alberto, and welcome again. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to have all of you on this webinar today. Thank you for making the time. I do want to take this opportunity to sort of introduce RMI for some of you that we have not engaged or have not gotten in touch with RMI. For a lot of you, I think we have been engaging. So very quickly, RMI, formerly Rocky Mountain Institute, is an independent nonprofit organization, one of the largest energy transition nonprofit organizations in the world. We have over 700 experts and present in over 70 countries. We work with global partners to accelerate clean energy transition globally, and our mission is to transform global energy systems to secure a clean, prosperous, zero-carbon future for all. We've actually taken a balanced approach in how we're doing this. One is decarbonizing the economies of the world's biggest emitters at pace and as quickly as possible. And second is to ensure that we're building equitable access to clean energy and encourage growth in emerging economies. Under our Africa Energy Program, the umbrella program, which this project has been implemented, we've worked with local partners such as some of you here to ensure sustainable electricity access for just and equitable development. And the 3 pillars you see here are some of the pillars that we have worked under. Scaling distributed energy, where we have worked with partners such as developers, financiers, government institutions to implement and test business models to catalyze sector growth. We also do know electricity in itself may not necessarily be able to drive economic development. And so efficient demand stimulation, where we enable communities and industries to adopt energy efficient technologies is very important and one of our biggest pillars. Lastly, we're working with government and utilities to plan electricity system investment across the continent. Our main effort, primarily in Africa, has been in Nigeria and in Ethiopia. However, through our Africa Mini-Grid program, we're present in 21 countries. Next slide. RMI in Nigeria has been present since 2017. And in January of 2024, we registered as a legal entity. The way we wanted to our take on how we can realize our mission is taking the think, do, scale approach, where we are identifying solutions, implementing them, and then scaling. And what you see here is a representation of some of the interventions that we've been doing in the country from the upstream and downstream. And this covers thought leadership and strategic guidance to the sector. A lot of you would have seen our DER roadmap that we published recently that shows a 20 plus gigawatt opportunity between now and 2033. We have supported NERC as well in embedded generation targets, the monitoring tool on how we ensure that DISCOs are meeting their targets. And recently, with support from Africa Climate Foundation, we launched our report on Harvesting Sunshine that looks at productive use of electricity on mini-grids, levelized cost of electricity. Capacity building and workforce development is also an important area of intervention, where we have trained Nigerian DISCOs and also worked with NERC in providing capacity on our roadmap and toolkit, which you would hear from our colleagues today, as well as our renewable embedded generation stakeholder convening. As part of project development support and techno-economic analysis, a lot of you would know that we are technical partners to the World Bank on the DARES project, identifying 40 interconnected mini-grid sites. We're also working with partners like USTDA to implement commercial and industrial business models. Through our catalytic climate capital, we're working towards ensuring that projects are accessing the right type of capital to ensure that, it's in a space like this, we're accessing, the funding that is required. And lastly, in terms of project execution and completion support, we're working with UK Pact, of course, our partners GIAP and USTDA in implementing embedded generation, interconnected mini-grids pilot, as well as commercial and industrial feasibility studies. And below the screen, you can see some of the partners that we've been working with. At this point, I want to hand over to my colleague from GIAP, Fauzia, who would take it up from there.
Thank you, Suleiman. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be here and also appreciate that everyone took their time to join us today. So I'll just speak a bit about GIAP and who we are for those that may not be familiar with our work. The Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet is an alliance that was launched in COP26, building on institutional knowledge and capital from an initial 3 partners: the Rockefeller Foundation, IKEA Foundation, Bezos Earth Fund, and very recently, the MasterCard Foundation. And our mission is to support developing countries to achieve energy access and energy transition. We work across Africa, Asia, and Latin America and the Caribbean. And the way we monitor or measure our success is based on 3 fundamental metrics: carbon, averting 4 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions, supporting energy access for 1 billion people, and enabling green jobs, about 150 million. Next slide, please. So this is a snapshot of our work in Nigeria. GIAP is committed to supporting Nigeria's energy transition plan with interventions primarily in the renewable energy space. So there are 3 main types of interventions we support: strengthening, enabling environment, especially through TA to the government, facilitating innovation and entrepreneurship, that's support to private sector, and lastly, deploying risk capital to unlock investments into the RE sector. So in a nutshell, we deploy philanthropic capital to enable electrification. And this gives an overview of some of the activities around DREs. We are currently funding the Energy Transition Office through the SE for All, and they are primarily championing the ETP priorities, the Energy Transition Plan, coordinating the implementation and strategic comms and advocacy towards net zero by 2060. We are also working, or rather supported the launch and the delivery of the Integrated Energy Planning Tool, which is a platform that provides least cost electrification planning for DRE projects and other energy access projects. We also have a number of facilities that we have supported. We have the Energy Transition and Access Facility for Africa, that's ETAFA, and that's providing low-cost local currency financing to enable the deployment of DRE projects in Nigeria, and that's in partnership with Chapel Hill Ghana. That's a 50 million local currency debt facility. We also have a demand aggregation for renewable technologies. That's made up of two components. We have a working capital facility in partnership with Olon, and that's providing capital for DRE projects, asset procurement. Then we have a second component of that platform, which is aggregated procurement in partnership with Odyssey, and that allows for pooling and aggregating procurement orders to achieve economies of scale. And our work around entrepreneurship and innovation, I would speak on. Okay, I think my time is up. Is my time up? So yes, maybe just to highlight our work around support to DRE companies with Olon, that's venture capital support, as well as RBF support under the UEF with SE for All. And lastly, which is very important to the conversation today, is our partnership with RMI, and that's the interconnected mini grids pilots, as well as ecosystem building to scale up. And this has provided some inputs towards DARES. We have been supporting the World Bank in the DARES design, and that includes some upstream project preparatory work. So thank you very much for listening. And as I mentioned earlier, we stay very interested in hearing more about our partners and how we can further support the DRE market in Nigeria. Thank you, and over to you, Alberto.
Yeah, thank you so much, Fausia. The next slide establishes, next slide, please. The next slide establishes a baseline of common mutual understanding for all participants about what DERs, distributed energy resources, are, and utility-enabled DERs. Contrary to a non-connected DER, a utility-enabled DER can buy and or sell electricity to and from the national utility or a regional grid. A major advantage of a utility-enabled DER solution is that it leverages existing distribution network infrastructure and supplies a location, a certain location or community where there is existing weak grid supply. Utility-enabled DERs create a win-win-win business opportunity. It's a win for utilities as it can leverage private capital to improve distribution networks, increase generation, and retain customers that otherwise may defect from the grid. DER developers can leverage existing infrastructure and utility customer relationships to access customers at scale. Lastly, it's a win for customers as they receive cheaper and more reliable electricity, a blend from the grid and the DER. Moving into the next slide, and before we dive into the DER Toolkit resources, it is important to mention that in parallel, RMI has developed a roadmap to scale these solutions by 2033, in 10 years' time. The opportunity to host DERs across the 11 service territories in Nigeria is at least 22 gigawatts, offering the potential to reduce ATC&C losses by 20% in those feeders or locations where a DER is located. These 22 gigawatts can unlock a $50 million revenue increase opportunity on yearly basis on average across DISCOs. This in turn represents a 14 billion investment opportunity. For more information on the roadmap analysis and recommendations, please scan the QR code on the slide, which will take you to the report. Moving forward, I would like to invite my colleague Olatunde Okeowo to walk us through the DR Toolkit objectives and some of the resources that we have developed.
Thank you, Alberto. So as Alberto said, I'll be taking you through an overview of the DR Toolkit. So firstly, what the DR Toolkit is a set of standardized resources for the key documents that are used when implementing a utility-enabled DR project. On the right here, you can see the main categories of these toolkit resources. So there are 5 of them, which we'll go into more detail on subsequent slides. The tools were designed with 3 main objectives in mind. So firstly, we wanted to improve the understanding of utility-enabled DR business models among DISCOs and developers with the aim of increasing the ability to implement these business models. Secondly, to provide useful guides and templates that could simplify and accelerate the implementation process for DISCOs and developers. So that when you are developing a project, you don't have to start from scratch with every new document. You have a template you can work from, which reduces the time you need for the work you're doing. And lastly, to standardize and harmonize documentation between DISCOs and developers so that both parties are working from the same set of documents, which will reduce misalignment and accelerate the overall implementation process. So it's clear that there's a common thread that runs through these objectives, which is really to increase the speed at which DR projects can be implemented. And on the next slide, we'll see why it's really important to increase the speed. So the first wave of projects has shown that these projects are really taking too long to implement in Nigeria. We've tracked 4 operational utility-enabled DR projects in Nigeria. One of them was implemented in about 9 months, which is very good. But the other 3 took between 3 and 5 years to be implemented. And this is over 5 years actually to be implemented, which is really too long. That's people waiting for over 3 years before they actually have the benefits of the project that was promised them. So we think these projects can be implemented in about 12 months, which is a timeline that has been met in other projects from other locations where DRs are a bit more advanced than in Nigeria. And the toolkit, as I mentioned, was developed with that aim in mind to ensure that in Nigeria, DISCOs and developers can work together to implement these projects within a timeline, similar to 12 months. Next slide, please. So I'll just give an overview of the resources in the toolkit, and I'll pass it on after soon to my colleague Fola to go into some more detail on these resources. Next slide. So firstly, there's the DR Toolkit Handbook, which is the overarching guide to the tools in the toolkit. It explains what the different tools are, when to use them, and how to use them effectively. So this is where you start from when you want to use the toolkit. And as I mentioned, there are 5 categories of the tools in the toolkit. We have the project implementation plan templates, which provide explanations of the steps that you need to take when implementing a DR project. We also have project agreement templates, which include both term sheets and contract agreements. So the term sheets are just summaries of the key points that you see in a contract, which developers and DISCOs can agree on before you even start going through a much more detailed contract agreement. We also have financial modeling templates, procurement templates, which include both the procurement documents and the documents to also evaluate the bids once they are received. And finally, best practices for implementing DR. So we have case studies and a benchmark cost report, which is currently being drafted. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to explain the handbook a bit more. So like I said, it's the guide on how to use the tools. So once when you want to use the toolkit, that's where you start from to let you know what tools are available and at which stages during the implementation process you need to use each of those tools. So firstly, like it introduces users to utility-enabled DERs and how they can benefit DISCOs and their customers. It describes why the toolkit is necessary, the objectives, and like I said, how and when to use these tools during the implementation process. And one other thing that the toolkit handbook also does is it describes some wider initiatives that can help DISCOs to successfully scale DER. So beyond just the toolkit itself, there are other things we think that can contribute to scaling DERs more effectively, and this toolkit also does that. So I'll pass it on to my colleague Fola now to take us through some of these tools in more detail.
Thank you very much, Ola. So starting with the project implementation plan templates, these templates that we have for each business model helps DISCOs and developers across the project lifecycle. It explains how to select the right sites, the features that developers and DISCOs should consider during site selection, describes the step-by-step process from selection all the way to operations, and importantly, defines the responsibilities between DISCOs and developers, which is a crucial step to squeeze the timelines that Ola mentioned earlier. We also have a list of common risk and mitigation steps across the project lifecycle, as well as the regulatory steps needed to be taken to develop these projects. Next slide, please. Our project agreement templates and term sheets define the key terms and transaction arrangements to be negotiated by each parties. This includes things like the priority hours of supply between the DER solar system and the DISCO grid, the tariffs, so the blended tariffs that customers would pay, as well as the utility tariffs, reliability standards and current underperformance clauses, and so on. The term sheet can be used to agree terms before proceeding to signatures using the contract templates. Next slide, please. Our standardized financial model templates, which we have developed with key input from the DISCOs, would help users to calculate the blended tariffs customers would pay, as well as the financial returns for developers and DISCOs. This can help in facilitating the negotiations for these projects, and both developers and DISCOs can perform sensitivity analysis on key variables on these models. Next slide, please. Our project procurement templates, which we have developed to help DISCOs put out DER projects to tender, includes, the qualification documents as well as the request for proposal documents. We recommend two-stage procurement processes for the DISCOs, and we have developed those templates as well as the evaluation templates to help DISCOs evaluate project proposals from developers when they receive them. Ongoing DISCO procurements are already leveraging some of these resources. Next slide. Finally, our best practices reports would be used to share data-driven learnings and insights. We hope to share some learnings from the first sets of pilots using these resources. For example, we have data already showing how the costs, how the project costs are split across the first set of some of these interconnected mini-grid countries and mini-grid projects in the country, and how distribution and interconnection costs can be up to 46% of total project cost. Now I'll pass it over to my colleague Ridwan Zubair to speak a bit more about some of the project pilots that we're supporting.
Thank you, Fola. So far, we've supported about 4 DR projects across Nigeria. As I speak to you, 2 of them are operational, and I'm happy to take you through some of the key highlights and insights we have gathered from these 2 operational projects. Next slide, please. The first project I'm happy to speak about is the Total Interconnected Mini-Grid. This is the first utility-enabled DR in Nigeria with full interaction with the grid. This project is located in Nasarawa State. Some of the key insights from this project is that we saw a 3 times increase in the number of connections over the first 9 months that the project went operational. One other thing is that it's a collaboration between AEDC and the developer, which is PowerGen. This collaboration is something we want to see. It's the first of its kind in Nigeria, where the DISCO and the developer agrees to work together for a project of this nature. The result for the developer is that the average consumption for this type of mini-grid is about 5 times those of isolated mini-grid in sub-Saharan Africa. Another thing we noticed is that the availability hour from the grid has great impact on the final tariff to the customer. The more the DISCO is able to contribute to the DER, the lesser the customers will pay, and the more the developer needs to rely on backup from diesel generator or larger battery capacity, the higher the tariff that goes to the customer. One thing we are working on into the future is clarifying and standardizing roles and responsibility between the DISCO and the developer. We have learned from this first phase of project that, at the interconnection phase, you have the DISCO and the developer, trying to figure out who is responsible for this and who is supposed to do this. Jobs have been created, and the DISCOs have started realizing increase in the revenue they get from the same cluster prior to the incorporation of the DER. The project went live in November 2023. Next slide, please. I think the next project is the Zawachiki IMG in Kano. This project is a 1 megawatt solar plant, and it was developed by the Bagaja Renewables in collaboration with the Kano Electricity Distribution Company. This project, being the second interconnected mini-grid in Nigeria, has 868 customers so far. And one thing we noticed is that DR are not just meant for residential customers. This particular project is hosting 3 large industrial and commercial customers, one of them being the Kano dry port in Dala. Also, for this project, it has created about 17 new jobs, and then there has been increase in the collection efficiency and the billing efficiency of the DISCO prior to the commencement of the DR's operation. And because of this, the DISCO and the developer, the DISCO particularly, is moving ahead to partner more with developers and financiers to get more DR installed into their grid. I think there's a question in the chat which is asking how can one incorporate or integrate DR into the current distribution network in Nigeria. These 2 projects are testimonies that it is possible once you get your design right and you partner with the right stakeholders. It is possible for you to integrate DR into the existing network infrastructure. Thank you. I'll pass it back to Alberto.
Thank you so much, Ridwan. So we are actually a couple of minutes early, and that's great. After we heard from our speakers on the various components and resources of the DR Toolkit, we are now transitioning into a panel discussion. We have brought together a diverse and experienced group of panelists who will share their perspectives, representing utilities, developers, financiers, and NERC, the regulator. To kick things off, I'm delighted to introduce our first panelist, Omosede Imohe. Omosede is an accomplished energy investment professional with a strong track record in advancing renewable energy to end energy poverty in Africa. She currently leads the DER team at Abuja DISCO, one of Nigeria's largest electricity distribution companies, where she is responsible for developing and implementing utility-led DER projects. The first question goes to you, Omosede. From your experience, what tools and templates within the DER Toolkit are most useful for your day-to-day operations?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Alberto, for the opportunity to participate in the webinar. I would like to thank RMI and GIAP for developing the DER Toolkit. The DER resources were provided at a critical point for Nigerian distribution companies based on the regulatory requirement to procure electricity from renewable energy sources by 2025. For us at AEDC, one tool that we rely heavily on is the financial model template. It allows us to determine the end user tariffs based on the project costs provided by the developer. That way, we are able to sense check if the tariffs being proposed are reasonable. The model is also useful for us as a distribution company to understand the potential improvement in revenue for the DISCO and whether there's a strong business case for proceeding with the project. I particularly like the financial model, having also financial background. I like the simplicity. It's a very easy to use and easy to understand model, and I think it's one that would be greatly used by both DISCOs and developers because it has a wide use for both parties. Another tool that has been particularly useful to us at AEDC has been the project procurement templates. As part of the requirements for procuring embedded generation, as a DISCO, we are required to procure competitively. And so that means we have to conduct a number of procurement processes. And so without having standardized templates, it would make it difficult for us to always have to develop procurement documents from scratch. So the procurement templates have particularly helped us to streamline our procurement process and attract the right type of developers. It also makes you think through the kind of questions that you're asking these developers so that you're sure that you're getting the right type of partners to work with. AEDC recently commenced the procurement process for the migration of our feeders using embedded generation and franchising. And we used the RFP template as a starting point for developing the documents that went out to developers. Finally, the project agreement templates provide an excellent starting tool for negotiating key terms in the agreements. The templates give us a structured foundation, helping us save time in ensuring that all the critical, or most of the critical areas of the project are covered during negotiations, and both parties are clear on what terms we would need to agree in the final documents. So in summary, the financial model, the procurement documents, and project agreement templates have significantly improved our efficiency, allowing us to move more quickly in executing our projects. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Omosede. Very good answer. And I think this is exactly what we would like to hear from DISCOs and developers, that you are using the templates we put together. And these templates are a live document or set of documents. We intend to continue to iterate them as we, as a sector, realize that they need to be improved. Now, I would like to also hear the perspectives on the same question from the private sector. We have Victor Esenwoko, the country head for Nigeria and Ghana for Daystar Power. Victor, could you also speak about these resources, how these resources may be useful for a company like Daystar in its journey in the DER space, utility-enabled DER space particularly?
Perfect. Thank you again for having me. I think the toolkit is super helpful, and also echoing off what Omosede said, right? The financial modeling kits definitely will be one of the top two that we look at, because you need to make sure that whatever project you're working on is profitable and actually makes sense, right? Makes sense for all the parties involved. So you're looking at Daystar as a developer, looking at the potential client who has the end tariff to make sure it's viable, and also looking at the DISCO, because when it's time to have those tough discussions, you need to be able to show that there's value for everybody involved. And that tool actually makes it easier. It gives you a straightforward, simple to understand model that shows, okay, here's all the deductions, here's how we arrived at this, here's my cut, here's your cut. It basically promotes transparency and makes those type of negotiations a lot easier to have. The other toolkit I would like to highlight would be the agreement template, so the tripartite agreement template, right? So if you're looking at it from a developer's perspective, one of the key attributes to rolling out a project like this is bankability. So number one is the financial returns, right? I need to be able to give my investors, shall you see on the logo, a particular returns. The financial model does it. The contract helps us raise more funds, right? So bankability is an important key. Also, the contract governs how the project is going to go over the long-term period. So having that template actually makes it a lot easier, because I know there's a lot of back and forth between discos, the regulators, and developers. So having a template makes it easier to raise money, because it shows that all interests are accounted for and that the money is protected. Number two, it also fosters scalability, right? You don't want to have to develop a new contract every single time you want to go. With data, we have one project being commissioned. We have a couple in the pipeline as well. You need a template that allows you to go to a new disco, a new potential client, and say, here's a template. We've done this before. This caters to your concerns, caters to us, and it makes it easier to scale and continue to grow. So those two will be my top picks, but it has been very useful for DER projects and also day-to-day projects as well.
Thank you, Victor. We are seeing a lot of questions on the Q&A, and thank you for those who are prompting those questions. We are doing our best to respond to them. There are a couple of questions about whether we have run these templates and tools through other stakeholders. I think I mentioned that earlier, but I just wanted to say that financing institutions, government institutions, discos, and developers themselves have not only contributed to the development of these resources, but been major stakeholders, and we can say we are all co-developers for those questions in the chat. As you might be aware, NERC issued an order earlier this year for all discos to contract 10% of their power from bilateral agreements, of which 50% should come or has to come from renewable sources. Here, I would like to call for NERC's representative, Chigozie Valerie. Chigozie Valerie is a certified regulation specialist who has worked in the Nigerian power sector for about 2 decades. She's actively involved in developing regulatory frameworks to foster investment in the sector, and she currently serves as a team lead for the DER team at NERC. Chigozie, this question goes to you. How do you think the presented toolkit can help meet DER targets and bilateral agreements? And what additional resources could be beneficial for these targets?
Well, thank you very much, Alberto, and everyone for having me, and thank you to the participants. Yes, as I said, NERC issued the order for the discos to deploy by April 1st, 2025. And thanks to RMI for the toolkit, which has presented templates that are quite easy to understand, quite straight to the point. And what the Commission is looking at is really accelerated, fast-tracked deployments. Why? Because we all know the constraints that the grid has. So the sooner we can have DR projects, embedded generation projects across the discos, 11 discos, the better for us. And the discos will be able to serve their customers better. And for us, the most important toolkit, I would say, is the financial model. As someone earlier said, the former speaker, we're looking at cost recovery and ensuring that cost-effective tariffs are also presented for our approval, because before all costs are approved, they have to come through the Commission. And for us to attract private investments, there has to be cost reflectivity, right? So that's
We seem to have lost Chigozie. I hope I'm not the only one. So maybe while we recover Chigozie on the call, I actually wanted to ask the same question to Ikeja Electric. So we have Fatima Haliru from Ikeja Electric. Fatima brings over 14 years of diverse experience in customer experience, power purchase, and business development across the telecommunications and power sectors. She currently leads the power purchase team at Ikeja Electric, driving negotiations for energy transition, leveraging on DER agreements in line with net zero targets. She is also an RMI Energy Transition Academy Global Fellow So Fatima, how is Ikeja Electric leveraging on the DR Toolkit resources, and how do these resources could help to meet the NERC embedded generation targets?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Alberto, for that question. For the toolkits, it's a very welcome support from RMI. When you open those toolkits, you realize that the extensive work had gone into them. It's also quite interesting that, as you had previously mentioned, we contributed to these toolkits, but then to see how those contributions in the form of emails then translate to a final document and how they're beneficial to the project is quite commendable. We, like Omosede said, and how Chigozie was also saying, because cost-reflective tariff or tariff generally in the sector is a pain point for customers, the financial model template is very key to all parties, developers and discos alike. And for us, I think what the support that we would require is for NERC to also be quite involved in ensuring that there's some sort of balance in those conversations. As much as the toolkit is there, we require that the regulator is as involved in those negotiations as they are in the current negotiations for tariff on the MITO. One other template that is very important to me is the project implementation plan. One of the speakers had mentioned about the time that it takes and, emphasizing on speed. So the project implementation plan allows for both parties to manage expectations, also have a template that lets you or that helps to guide on what the expectations should be on time and on different levels of the project. And the project procurement also is quite commendable. Before it became a final toolkit, it was documents that had been shared with Ikeja Electric by the RMI team, and it really helped with getting developers, helping with the bidding process and the request for qualification, eventually request for proposals that we used from those for those projects. It was able to help us speed up on certain conversations in determining a developer to choose for a project. So I'd say that the toolkit is very commendable, is very welcome, and the advice is that for everyone that is in the sector, it is a welcome property for everyone to delve into and study and use for the projects that we're going into. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Fatima. So definitely what I'm hearing from the panelists so far is that the financial model templates, it's a really useful resource. You're all using it. So that's great. There is one more panelist that we haven't had an opportunity to hear from just yet. So I would like to introduce you now to our fifth panelist, Ojuru Adeniji. She is a vice president in the origination and structuring team at InfraCredit, where she currently leads the climate infrastructure team. She has experience in infrastructure finance, credit ratings, and financial analysis. Ojuru, this question goes to you. What are some major challenges that, in your experience, financiers and developers have faced in raising the ER project finance related? And what is the relationship with the need to standardize tools and processes?
Okay, thank you very much, Alberto, and the entire RMI team for first inviting InfraCredit to this session and putting this together. And thank you for the toolkit. I mean, we've had the chance to look at the toolkit and review the usability of the toolkit. And I know that we've been sharing conversations around that. So thank you and well done to the entire team. I mean, some of the challenges, yes, DER companies do face a myriad of, challenges. First is looking at the maturity profile of the companies. You're also concerned about the fact that the industry is nascent and projects themselves to, perceived as small scale. So there's just this perceived risk that is just, hovering all over them. So they face these challenges, and the same thing for the financiers. You're looking at the perceived risk when it comes to the DRE space entirely. So you want to ensure that while you're building standardized tools, you're embedding, from a lender's, risk acceptance criteria into those tools, such that because the maturity profile is not where it should be, you're giving the developers tools that will get them to be more mature companies. So yes, the toolkit sets aside, templates, agreements, processes, and I think it's very helpful because a number of these developers want to go into this, space, but they don't have the right tools, the right resources to get their projects, off the ground, even getting their projects prepared. So a number of them face this type of challenges. And it's also quite difficult for the financiers when you're looking at a project and you're asking for standard operating procedures for, developing a grid. How long would it take you to, to execute this project? What's the timeline? When you ask that type of question, you embed it in the structuring of the transaction because you're giving them financing. You need to know how long this financing is going to be used for. Do I need to embed things like a moratorium, such that the loan starts running, but you're not paying off right immediately the loan starts running. You're paying off perhaps after construction. So you want to embed those type of elements in it. So those are some of the challenges that the developers and then even from the financiers' perspective face. You need to have policies, you need to have processes, you need to have these procedures in place, the small scale nature, and sometimes too, you don't have consistent performance metrics across the industry. One of the things we found is you talk to developer A, they say it takes them 6 months. Another person says it takes them 18 months to deploy, right? When you start from the site selection to the identification, technical design, you're not able to put actual timelines, and you don't see that those timelines are repeated across projects in different locations. So I think I'll just stop here and take on additional questions.
Yeah, great answer. Thank you so much for offering those thoughts. I think you covered a lot, right? And one of the templates we have developed, the project implementation plan, tries to mitigate your last point about different projects spanning different timelines, which is a challenge not only in the utility-enabled DR space, but in the energy space in Nigeria and beyond Nigeria, right? It relates to SOPs, which you mentioned. It relates to increasing the capacity of many institutions and developers in Africa. I believe these challenges resonate with the audience, and I'm curious about what perspectives there might be from the private sector. We have Victor as a panelist. So Victor, any additional thoughts on the Daystar side on the same question? I'll repeat the question. What are some of the major challenges developers and financiers face when raising DR project finance? And how does this relate to the toolkit?
Perfect. I guess some of the biggest things for us would be ensuring viability of the project and some of the regulatory frameworks. The key thing for viability is making sure you're able to develop a project at a tariff that works for the clients, for the DISCO, and for yourself, right? So for instance, I know there is a DER project that we've been working on for quite some months, and there's been lots of back and forth, right? And the final thing now boils down to what's the blend between all sources and tariff you can give the client that the client is willing to pay, but at the same time gives them the guarantee of power they're looking for, but also keeps the DISCO happy that they're getting enough supply and revenue, and then they are also able to meet the obligations, right? So for us, the biggest risk most times is getting that return on investment and also looking at the regulatory framework, right? Also from a legal perspective, which is why I spoke about the agreement earlier, when I look at our investors, they have a tendency to back away from complex transactions, right? So a lot of times they like very straightforward, one client, no DISCO involved, you install, you collect your money and go. So whenever we try to pitch this, we need to dedicate a good amount of time to walk them through to say, okay, you know what, it's a more complex structure, yes, but here's how we plan to do it. here's the waterfall agreement, here's where the money comes from, here's how we guarantee it. Even though it's a long-term agreement, multiple players, so a lot of complexities, it's still something that we believe in is going to work and is the future of the country, right? So these things actually do take time. From what we've seen, we don't think it's a bottleneck in terms of it's not going to move forward, as we're seeing. We're signing DER projects, other companies are too. We've just noticed it does add a bit of a time gap. But that also speaks to the benefits of the toolkit, right? So that's why if we're able to standardize it, it becomes common practice in the industry. A new investor coming across this project would already be familiar with it. That's where the standardization really makes a big difference when it's time to scale, right? Because if I go to a bank, a PE, a VC, if I go to different investors, anyone who's not had this direct experience is going to first hesitate, versus when it becomes standardized set of templates, kits we use across multiple investors, it now becomes, okay, this is the norm. It's looking like a regular solar PPA. Most times now, investors don't really have questions because they understand how it's meant to work. And because this is something innovative we're really trying to push, I think that's where the tools and kits come in handy. But I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you, Victor. We have Chigozie back. Thank you for joining back, Chigozie. I'd like to turn it to you. I don't think you quite finished your point. You were explaining, financial models, code recovery. So over to you to finalize your response.
Yes. Yes, thank you. Sorry for that. I was saying that for us, the two toolkits, or all of them, are really beneficial to the discos and to our projects of ensuring that the discos deploy EGs by 1st of April 2025. But I was trying to say that apart from that, we also need, there are some additional resources that may be needed to help the Commission in achieving that. And thank you to RMI for the monitoring tool, because right now the conversation now is regular monitoring of the discos as they strive to deploy these EG projects. So that's why we have a DR team and the Commission looking at the work plan, looking at the timings, the timelines for deployments of these projects. And using the toolkits that we're working together on right now, it's going to be quite beneficial for us to see where there are challenges, and then we can nip them in the bud before it becomes essentially too late for them to deploy this, to finalize these transactions. Another thing that the Commission might want to see, because I know you asked for additional resources, continuous technical support to the discos will be very, very good. Apart from the toolkit, the discos also, along the value chain of the DR value chain, each disco will have issues or challenges with deploying these projects. Identifying sites is quite important, matching them with quality developers that have track record, like I said earlier, because at the end of the day, we want viable projects that are bankable, right? We want projects, well, if you see CNI projects where customers will get reliable service and they're able to pay. So essentially what the Commission is working on now is to make sure that the discos meet their targets, considering the benefits of DERs and embedded generation. Recently, if you're in Nigeria, you remember that about last week, we had grid collapse happening like 3 times. And Port Harcourt Disco was what they were bragging about their recent transaction with FIPL, where they had about 8 megawatts deployed in the ordnance area. So when there was grid collapse, people in the ordnance area they had full supply. So we're like, this is the time, it shows the benefits and demonstrates why we really need to focus so much on deploying DRs across the discos. And that is why the Commission is looking into working more with partners, having high level engagement with boards of discos, and looking at our regulatory frameworks. If there are some that need amendments, looking at our timelines for approving licenses. So these are the things we're working on now to ensure that come April 1st, 2025, the discos will be able to achieve their embedded generation and RE targets. To a great extent, even if they don't, we keep shifting the targets, but that's our plan for now. In summary, thank you very much, RMI, for working with the discos and also for partnering with the Commission. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chigozie. We are almost at the top of the hour, and I'd like to reserve a couple of minutes for some final remarks, but I would like to pose one last question to the panelists. The question is, and we've touched on this, but I think it's good to call it out specifically. Where do you see opportunities, additional opportunities to standardize processes or tools to speed up transactions and project finance? If you have an answer, please come off mute. If we can have answers in like 30, 40 seconds, that'd be great.
Okay, I think I'll just go first. Okay. Okay, so I mean, one of the areas that comes to mind very easily, and I think standardization is great, is innovative, and it would really help to close the time that it takes to execute a project, right? I think it's just standardizing just technical standards, having uniform technical specifications so that if Mr. A or Mr. B, different financiers come on board, they know this is the uniform technical specification. Perhaps the regulators can help with that. And then the likes of RMI as well, can help with that. Just having uniform technical specifications, then also standardizing the regulatory environment as well to help reduce uncertainties for investors, I think would also be useful. Quality assurance to help check, if these standards are followed, and having guidelines. Financing also, standardizing the financing agreements, most of which you have at the moment, and also the risk acceptance framework too, would help attract investors, right, into this space a lot more. Yes, you do have great financial models, but you want to ensure that you're embedding the risk acceptance criteria of the financiers that you want to work with. So I think it's important that these documents, I mean, they're great feedback that you've gotten from Ikeja Electric, AEDC, the very useful tools as well, even from Victor as well. I think we should test it on more projects. Let's test it as we test it on more projects. Then we're able to iterate and say, okay, perhaps this clause doesn't work, this other clause will work. Once we embed the financier's perspective, I can assure you that it will take a shorter time to completing these projects because the financier understands the standard clauses that they want to see in this project agreement templates are already embedded in it. It wouldn't take as long. The lawyers wouldn't spend so much time in, unpacking the documents, unpacking the terms. Clauses are already embedded, and it will now take a shorter time in terms of reaching financial close and getting the projects off the ground. So standardizing technical, financial, even ESG, incorporating even impact data to how you also measure impact. What communities are you going to reach out to, and all of that. I know that RMI has identified communities alongside the DISCO, so that's great. That would also help us get there quicker. I'll stop here for others. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Obiajuru, for offering these thoughts. I'm going to take it back to wrap us up, but thank you all the panelists for your contributions and your thoughts. I guess, we are almost at the top of the hour, and I would like to take just 1 minute to wrap us up. Before I offer some final remarks, we would love to hear your feedback on the webinar. My colleague Collins is about to paste a link in the chat where you can fill in a simple survey about today's webinar. If you have enjoyed the webinar, if you found it helpful, please fill in the survey. Similarly, if you have any suggestions or areas where you would have like us to cover more extensively, please send us your feedback through the survey. Now, before closing this webinar, we have presented the DER Toolkit resources and explained how utilities, developers, financiers, and the broader ecosystem can use and leverage them to increase data transparency, which is very important, streamline transactions, which we have touched on, and ultimately accelerate DER project timelines. We've also heard from our panelists on how the toolkit is helpful on day-to-day basis, challenges that continue to persist, and what we need to do as a sector to unlock scale. Scale is important. The challenge ahead is very large. With that, I would like to thank you all the audience for joining us today, our speakers, our panelists, and wish you a very good rest of your day. Thank you.